October 19th, 1941. 031. 2 hours. Moscow, Soviet Union. Colonel Andrei Khrulev stood alone in the basement of the Kremlin's Logistics Command Center, staring at a map that sentenced his nation to death. The room was silent, except for the hum of a single electric bulb. Outside, temperatures hovered near freezing. Inside, the chill came from something far colder than the Russian autumn: mathematics. On the desk before him lay 2 columns of numbers, written in precise Cyrillic script. The left column tracked Soviet tank production 2047 T-34 and KV-1 tanks manufactured in September. The right column tracked truck production 812 vehicles. Krulev's hand trembled as he reached for his cigarette. He was 51 years old, a logistics expert who had served since the revolution. A man who understood that wars were won not with courage but with calculations, and these calculations were catastrophic. 300 kilometers to the west, Operation Typhoon, Hitler's final assault on Moscow, had erupted like a tidal wave. Army Group Center, 1.9 million soldiers, 1,700 tanks, 14,000 artillery pieces, advancing on 3 converging axes. The Wehrmacht had already encircled 673,000 Soviet soldiers at Vyazma and Bryansk. The road to Moscow lay open. Stalin's response was frantic. Produce more tanks. Every factory, from Leningrad to the Urals, worked triple shifts. Welders collapsed at their stations. Women and teenagers assembled gun sights with frostbitten fingers. Tank production soared. But Khrulev knew the truth that no one else seemed to grasp. Tanks without trucks were metal coffins. A T-34 tank carried enough fuel to travel approximately 50 kilometers before its 500 Litarang tank ran dry. It carried 39 rounds of 76 mm ammunition. Once those shells were expended, perhaps after 2 hours of combat, the tank became a pillbox. Unless supply trucks arrived with fuel and ammunition, the most magnificent tank in the world was immobile junk, and the Soviet Union was running out of trucks. Before the war, the USSR possessed roughly 272,000 military trucks. After 4 months of catastrophic defeats, approximately 180,000 had been destroyed, captured, or abandoned. Factories that once produced trucks had been evacuated eastward ahead of the German advance. Disassembled, loaded onto rail cars, shipped to the Urals, where they sat in pieces, awaiting reconstruction. Khrulev stubbed out his cigarette and lit another immediately. The mathematics were brutal. Soviet forces needed a minimum of 4.2 trucks per tank to maintain offensive operations. Fuel trucks, ammunition trucks, repair trucks, recovery trucks. With 2,047 tanks rolling off assembly lines monthly, they required 8,600 new trucks per month. They produced 812. The deficit compounded like interest on an unpayable debt. Every week the ratio worsened. More tanks, fewer trucks. The Red Army was building a fist without an arm to swing it. Through the basement's narrow window, Khrulev could hear the distant rumble of explosions. German bombers. The Luftwaffe had intensified raids on Moscow, targeting railway stations, bridges, factories. Air raid sirens wailed every night now. People slept in metro stations. The NKVD had already evacuated government archives. Diplomats had fled to Kuibyshev. Everyone could sense it. Moscow was dying. Khrulev picked up the telephone. It was connected to a single line. Scrambled, encrypted, routed through 3 relay stations. He dialed. After 4 rings, a voice answered in English. Soviet Purchasing Commission, Washington. This is Khrulev. The list I sent last week. Increase the truck order. Double it. Triple it if possible. A pause. Colonel, the Americans are already... I don't care what they're already doing. Krulev's voice cracked. Tell them we need trucks more than tanks, more than planes, more than anything. If they send us 10,000 tanks but no trucks to supply, do you understand? We lose. Another pause. Longer this time. I'll relay the message, Colonel. Khrulev hung up. He walked to the map on the wall. A massive representation of European Russia, dotted with red pins marking Soviet positions, black pins marking German advances. The black pins formed a tightening noose around Moscow. In 3 weeks, perhaps 4, the Wehrmacht would reach the capital's outskirts. Soviet defenses would hold for a time. The newly produced T-34s would savage German panzer divisions. Soviet artillery would chew apart infantry assaults. And then, after the first 50 kilometers of advance, After the first 2 hours of combat, Soviet tanks would run dry, ammunition exhausted, fuel depleted, stranded on frozen roads while German supply lines, primitive, horse-drawn but functional, kept feeding the Wehrmacht advance. Moscow would fall not because Soviet soldiers lacked courage, not because Soviet tanks were inferior. Moscow would fall because arithmetic was indifferent to bravery. Khrulev returned to his desk and began writing a report for Stalin. His hand no longer trembled. There was a strange clarity in facing certain doom. He titled the document, "On the Critical Shortage of Automotive Transport and Its Consequences for the Defense of Moscow." What Khrulev didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that 7,200 kilometers away, in a factory in South Bend, Indiana, a solution was already being manufactured. The Studebaker Corporation had just received the largest military truck order in American history. And those trucks were about to change the mathematics of the Eastern Front. To understand how the Soviet Union reached the brink of logistical collapse, you must understand the fundamental asymmetry of Soviet industrial philosophy. Since the first five-year plan in 1928, Stalin had obsessed over heavy industry, steel mills, tank factories, artillery foundries. These were the metrics of power. Soviet propaganda films showed molten steel pouring from blast furnaces, T-34 hulls moving down assembly lines, workers hoisting red banners above completed tanks. Trucks were boring, trucks were invisible. Trucks didn't appear in propaganda posters, so Soviet truck production remained stunted. In 1940, the USSR manufactured approximately 136,000 trucks, respectable but inadequate for a military of 7 million soldiers spread across the largest country on Earth. Worse, Soviet truck designs were primitive. The ZIS-5, the Red Army's standard truck, was essentially a 1930s American design produced under license with a 3.5-ton cargo capacity and zero winterization features. When temperatures dropped below -20 degrees Celsius, ZIS-5 engines froze solid, radiators cracked, oil turned to sludge. Mechanics had to light fires beneath engine blocks just to start the vehicles. Many never started at all. Soviet trucks were fair-weather machines in a nation where fair weather lasted approximately 4 months per year. Then came June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa. 3 million German soldiers smashed across the Soviet border in the largest invasion in human history. The Red Army collapsed. Entire divisions evaporated. Tank battalions were encircled and, critically, tens of thousands of trucks were captured or abandoned. By October 1941, the Wehrmacht had seized so many Soviet trucks that German logistics units were using them. They weren't impressed. German after-action reports described Soviet trucks as mechanically unreliable, inadequately powered, and unsuitable for extended operations. The Germans preferred their own vehicles, Opel Blitz trucks, Mercedes-Benz cargo haulers, but even these constituted only 20% of Wehrmacht logistics. The remaining 80%? Horses. The German army that invaded the Soviet Union relied on 750,000 horses to haul supplies. Panzer divisions raced ahead with mechanized speed, but behind them came endless columns of horse-drawn wagons, moving at 8 kilometers per hour through mud and snow. This created a fundamental tension in German operations. Tanks could advance rapidly, but supplies could not keep pace. Wehrmacht commanders called it the logistics gap, the space between the spearhead and the supply base. The wider the gap, the more vulnerable the advance. Tanks without fuel, infantry without ammunition, artillery without shells. But in October 1941, the logistics gap favored Germany. Why? Because Soviet trucks were disappearing faster than they could be. Here's the mathematics that haunted Krulev's nightmares. Soviet monthly truck losses, approximately 12,000 vehicles, destroyed, captured, or broken beyond repair. Soviet monthly truck production, net monthly deficit, 11,188 trucks. At this rate, the Red Army's automotive transport would cease to exist by February 1942. Tank production, meanwhile, surged. Factories in Kharkov, Stalingrad, and the Urals operated around the clock. The T-34 medium tank, arguably the finest armored vehicle of the war, rolled off assembly lines at unprecedented rates. The KV-1 heavy tank, impervious to most German anti-tank guns, joined frontline units by the hundreds. These tanks were magnificent. The T-34 featured sloped armor that deflected German shells, a 76 mm gun that could penetrate any panzer at combat range, and wide tracks that distributed weight across snow and mud. German tankers feared it. Panzer Commander Otto Carius later wrote, "The T-34 was the best tank of the war. We had nothing comparable until the Panther arrived in 1943. But magnificence meant nothing without mobility. A T-34 consumed approximately 185 liters of diesel per 100 kilometers. In combat conditions, constant maneuvering, high-speed positioning, consumption doubled. A single tank required a dedicated fuel truck to sustain operations for more than a day. Artillery units needed trucks to haul shells. Infantry divisions needed trucks to transport troops and supplies. Medical units needed trucks to evacuate wounded. The entire operational concept of modern warfare, fluid, mobile, mechanized, depended on trucks. And the Soviet Union was running out. Khrulev understood the cascading consequences. Without trucks, Soviet counteroffensives would fail after the first few kilometers. Without trucks, newly produced tanks would sit idle at factory gates. Without trucks, armies defending Moscow would exhaust their ammunition stockpiles and be unable to resupply. The Wehrmacht didn't need to destroy every Soviet tank. They just needed to wait for Soviet logistics to collapse under its own weight. Stalin, of course, didn't see it this way. In meetings, he demanded more tanks, more aircraft, more artillery. When Khrulev attempted to explain the truck crisis, Stalin interrupted, "Comrade Khrulev, do you suggest we fight the fascists with trucks? Tanks win battles?" This was the fundamental misunderstanding that nearly lost the war. Tanks don't win battles. Logistics wins battles. Tanks are merely the visible tip of an enormous logistical iceberg. Fuel refineries, ammunition factories, supply depots, railway networks, and above all, trucks. But Stalin wouldn't listen. So Khrulev took matters into his own hands. In August 1941, the Soviet Purchasing Commission in Washington had negotiated the first Lend-Lease agreements with the United States. Initially, American aid focused on aircraft and raw materials, but Khrulev sent urgent cables, priority request, trucks, American manufacture, quantity maximum possible. American officials were puzzled. Why trucks? Why not tanks or bombers? They didn't understand yet. Neither did Stalin. Neither did most Soviet commanders. Only Khrulev and a handful of logistics officers grasped the truth. Moscow wouldn't be saved by heroes or superweapons. Moscow would be saved, if it could be saved at all, by a fleet of mass-produced, utterly unglamorous American-built cargo trucks. The Studebaker US6 was about to become the most important weapon of the Eastern Front, and nobody would ever hear about it. November 7th, 1941, 0600 hours, Arkhangelsk Port, Soviet Arctic. The first convoy arrived in darkness. Captain Viktor Petrov stood on the frozen dock as American Liberty ships emerged from the pre-dawn gloom like gray ghosts. Snow fell in thick curtains. The temperature was minus 18 degrees Celsius. Ice chunks the size of automobiles drifted in the harbor. Petrov commanded the 127th Independent Automotive Battalion, a unit that, on paper, possessed 96 trucks. In reality, he had 37 functional vehicles. The rest were broken, burned, or buried somewhere along the retreat from Smolensk. He watched as the first Liberty ship, SS John Barry, secured to the dock. Cranes swung into position. Cargo nets descended into the holds. And then, emerging from the ship's belly, came something Petrov had never seen before. A truck. But, unlike any Soviet truck, the Studebaker US6 ton cargo truck was a mechanical revelation. It featured a 6-cylinder Hercules JXD engine producing 87 horsepower, 4-wheel drive, 10 forward gears, ground clearance of 275 millimeters, higher than any Soviet truck, dual rear axles rated for 2,500 kilograms of cargo. But the specifications don't capture what made it extraordinary. Soviet trucks were temperamental machines that demanded constant maintenance. ZIS-5 required an oil change every 1,000 kilometers. Fan belts snapped in cold weather. Carburetors iced over. Electrical systems failed randomly. Mechanics joked bitterly that ZIS-5 stood for Super Eisrut, a crude expression roughly translating to ass and shit. The Studebaker US6 was different. It was designed for American farmers and rural mail carriers, people who drove hundreds of kilometers weekly across dirt roads in all weather with minimal maintenance infrastructure. American engineers had created a truck that simply worked. The engine used a pressurized lubrication system that functioned down to -40 degrees Celsius. The electrical system was weatherproofed. The transmission was nearly indestructible. Most importantly, it was idiot-proof. Soviet conscripts, many of whom had never driven any vehicle before being drafted, could operate a Studebaker after minimal training. The steering was power-assisted. The clutch required less force than Soviet models. The four-wheel drive engagement was a simple lever, not the complex mechanical process required by Soviet trucks. As Petrov watched the first Studebaker drive off the ship, windshield wipers clearing snow, engine purring smoothly in temperatures that would freeze a ZIS 5 solid, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. Over the next 3 days, 438 Studebaker trucks were unloaded at Arkhangelsk. They formed columns and drove south toward Moscow. 1,100 kilometers through snow, ice, and sub-zero temperatures. Not one broke down en route. By November 15th, the first Studebakers reached Soviet units defending Moscow's western approaches. The impact was immediate and mathematical. Here's the logistics equation that changed. Before Studebakers, 1 Soviet ZIS 5 truck 395 ton cargo capacity, 50% operational readiness, requires 2 support vehicles, effective cargo delivery, 1.75 tons per truck per trip. Fuel efficiency, 35 liters per truck, 100 kilometers, maintenance hours per 100 kilometers, 18 hours after Studebakers. 1 Studebaker US6 5-ton cargo capacity, 95% operational readiness. Requires 0 support vehicles, effective cargo delivery, 2.3, 8 tons per truck per trip. Fuel efficiency, 2010 liters per 100 kilometer. Maintenance hours per 100 kilometers, 4 hours. Each Studebaker effectively replaced 4 Soviet trucks. This wasn't incremental improvement. This was a force multiplier. December 5, 1941, 0430 hours. Krasnaya Polyana, 30 kilometers northwest of Moscow. Colonel Ivan Yushchuk prepared for what Soviet propaganda would later call the Great Counter-Offensive. Yushchuk commanded a tank brigade, 48 T-34 tanks, supported by motorized infantry and artillery. Under normal circumstances, Yushchuk's brigade could attack for approximately 6 hours before outrunning its supplies. Soviet logistics doctrine called this the operational radius, the distance a unit could advance before needing a resupply pause lasting 2 hours. But December 5th wasn't normal circumstances. Behind Yushchuk's tanks waited 72 Studebaker trucks, fuel trucks, ammunition trucks, trucks carrying spare parts, food, medical supplies, all American-built, all running perfectly in -32-degree weather that had frozen half the German vehicles solid. At 0500 hours, Soviet artillery opened fire. The barrage lasted 40 minutes. German positions disappeared beneath a storm of high-explosive shells. At 0540 hours, Yushchuk's T-34s surged forward. The German 106th Infantry Division, exhausted, frostbitten, low on ammunition, collapsed immediately. Wehrmacht soldiers, many without winter uniforms, surrendered in hundreds. Those who retreated found their vehicles frozen, their horses dead from cold and starvation. Yushchuk's tanks advanced 23 kilometers the first day. Normally this would mark the end of the advance. Fuel exhausted, ammunition depleted. Time to halt, consolidate, wait for supplies. But at 1900 hours, the Studebakers arrived. 72 trucks navigated frozen roads in darkness, following routes marked by scouts. They refueled every tank, restocked every ammunition rack, delivered hot food and winter coats. At 0200 hours, they departed back to supply depots. At 060 hours, December 6th, Yushchuk attacked again. The Germans couldn't comprehend it. How were Soviet units sustaining offensive operations in the worst winter in decades? How were tanks advancing continuously when German vehicles couldn't move at all? Wehrmacht war diaries from December 1941 record the confusion. The enemy maintains offensive pressure despite a temperature of -35 degrees. Our vehicles were immobilized. Enemy trucks continue operating. How is this possible? They didn't know about the Studebakers. German intelligence never identified American trucks as a critical factor. After the war, when historians analyzed Operation Typhoon's failure, most focused on German mistakes. Starting the offensive too late, underestimating Soviet reserves, lacking winter equipment. Few mentioned trucks, but in the frozen hell outside Moscow, Soviet tank commanders knew the truth. Major General Dmitry Lelushenko commanded the Soviet 30th Army during the December counteroffensive. In his memoir, he wrote, "American trucks saved us. Simple as that. Our own trucks froze, our horses died, but the Studebakers kept running. We advanced because we could supply our advance. The Germans retreated because they couldn't supply their defense. The mathematics of mobility had reversed. In October, the Wehrmacht possessed superior logistics. Primitive but functional. Soviet logistics was collapsing. By December, American trucks had stabilized Soviet supply lines while German logistics disintegrated under winter's assault. December 16, 1941, 1400 hours. Klin, 85 kilometers northwest of Moscow, Colonel Yushchuk sat in his command tank reading reports. His brigade had advanced 147 kilometers in 11 days, an operational tempo that would have been impossible with Soviet trucks alone. Casualties? Moderate. Tank losses? 12 T-34s destroyed, 9 repairable. Ammunition expenditure? 4,200 shells. Fuel consumption? 118,000 liters. All resupplied continuously by American trucks. Across the table, his logistics officer, a laconic Siberian named Orlov, was smoking and reviewing the next day's supply schedule. "How many Studebakers do we have now?" Yushchuk asked. 84. Orlov replied. 12 more arrived this morning from Arkhangelsk. Losses? 2. One threw a track on ice, rolled into a ditch. Crew unhurt, truck repairable. One took shrapnel from a Stuka attack, burned. Yushchuk did the mathematics in his head. Out of 438 trucks delivered in early November, operating continuously for 6 weeks in Arctic conditions, under air attack across terrible roads, only 2 were combat losses. The ZIS-5 would have lost half the fleet by now. "Comrade Colonel," Orlov said, tapping ash from his cigarette, "these American trucks, they're not tanks. They're not glamorous, but they're winning the war." Yushchuk nodded slowly. Outside, snow fell. The temperature was -38 degrees. German forces were retreating toward defensive positions 200 kilometers west. Moscow was saved. And the weapon that saved it? The unglamorous, mass-produced, perfectly engineered Studebaker US6 would continue arriving by the thousands. By war's end, the Soviet Union would receive 477,785 American trucks through Lend-Lease Studebakers, Dodges. They would carry supplies from Stalingrad to Berlin. But the first 438, the trucks that arrived in November 1941, those were the ones that changed everything, because they arrived when mathematics declared Moscow doomed, and they rewrote the equation. But the story of the Studebaker isn't really about trucks. It's about the invisible war. The conflict fought not on battlefields but in factories, shipyards, and railway networks. The war where victory was determined not by courage or tactics, but by industrial systems that most people never saw. Consider the physics of warfare at scale. When Operation Barbarossa began in June 1941, the Wehrmacht possessed approximately 3,600 tanks. This represented Germany's entire accumulated production since rearmament began in the mid-1930s. Each tank was an expensive, precision-manufactured weapon requiring skilled labor and specialized steel alloys. By December 1941, approximately 2,300 of those tanks were destroyed or inoperable. German industry frantically produced replacements, but German tank production in 1941 totaled only 3,790 vehicles, barely enough to offset losses. Meanwhile, despite catastrophic defeats, Soviet tank production in 1941 reached 6,590 tanks. How? Factory evacuation. When the Wehrmacht surged eastward, Stalin ordered an industrial exodus unparalleled in history. Entire factories were dismantled. Machine tools, assembly equipment, raw materials, loaded onto trains, and shipped to the Urals, Siberia, Kazakhstan, 1,523 factories relocated, 1.5 million rail carloads, 2.5 million workers evacuated. It was chaos. Factories arrived as scattered components, machine tools sat in open fields under snow, workers lived in tents, barracks, or earthen dugouts. The Urals tank factory in Chelyabinsk operated through winter 104, 1 through 2 without a roof. Snow fell on assembly lines. Workers wore every piece of clothing they owned and still froze. But production continued, and this is where American trucks became the invisible multiplier. Soviet factories could produce tanks because America supplied the logistics infrastructure to support them. Lend-Lease provided not just trucks, but the entire industrial ecosystem that made tank production possible. Aluminum for aircraft engines used in tank manufacturing, 301,000 tons high-octane aviation fuel used in training and transport, 2.7 million tons steel, raw material for tank hulls, 1.9 million tons machine tools for precision manufacturing, 38,100 machines, railroad locomotives, 540,000 rail cars, telephone wire for communications, 956,000 kilometers, but above all, trucks. 477,785 trucks allowed the Soviet Union to concentrate its industrial capacity on weapons production, while America provided the logistics fleet. It was industrial specialization on a national scale. Here's the comparison that reveals everything. German industrial philosophy. Pursue perfection in every component. Tigers superior to T-34s. True. Panthers superior to Shermans. Arguably true. German trucks superior to Allied trucks. False, but they believed it. Result: small quantities of excellent weapons. Soviet-American combined philosophy. Soviets produce adequate weapons in massive quantities. Americans produce excellent logistics in massive quantities. Result: adequate weapons excellently supplied. Overwhelmed perfect weapons inadequately supplied. The Tiger tank was mechanically magnificent. It was also mechanically complex. It required 300,000 man-hours to build. Germany produced 1,347 Tigers during the entire war. The T-34 was mechanically adequate. It was also mechanically simple. It required 3,000 man-hours to build. The Soviet Union produced 84,000 T-34s, but here's the crucial point. Those 84,000 T-34s could only function because American trucks supplied them. Without Lend-Lease trucks, Soviet tank production would have collapsed under its own weight. Tanks would pile up at factory gates, unable to reach front lines. Tanks at front lines would run out of fuel and ammunition. The Wehrmacht actually experienced this problem. German tank production increased steadily throughout the war, but German logistics couldn't support the tanks they built. Panthers and Tigers sat immobilized for lack of fuel. Crews abandoned vehicles after minor mechanical failures because recovery vehicles couldn't reach them. Quality became irrelevant when quantity was unsustainable. A single Panther tank required 8 trucks for fuel, ammunition, spare parts, specialized recovery vehicle, SDKFZ-9, dedicated maintenance crew 2, 5 liters of fuel per kilometer, 200 hours maintenance per 1,000 kilometer. A single T-34 tank required 4 trucks for fuel, ammunition, spare parts, Studebakers, standard tow vehicle, minimal maintenance crew, 1.85 liters of fuel per kilometer, 80 hours maintenance per 1,000 km over multiply across divisions, armies, fronts. The Panther was the better tank. The T-34, supported by Studebaker trucks, was the better system, and modern warfare isn't won by superior weapons, it's won by superior systems. This is the lesson that military historians they focus on tank sevos, tank duels, on tactical brilliance, on individual heroism. These things matter, but they're the visible surface of a much deeper contest. The real Battle of Moscow wasn't fought at Klin or Krasnaya Polyana. It was fought in Detroit, where the Studebaker factory produced 197,678 US6 trucks during the war. It was fought at South Bend, Indiana, where workers welded frames and installed engines. It was fought on Arctic convoys, where merchant sailors braved U-boats to deliver cargoes that included nothing glamorous, just trucks. The Soviet Union could have built the finest tanks on Earth, crewed by the bravest soldiers, commanded by the most brilliant generals, and still lost if those tanks couldn't move, couldn't shoot, couldn't sustain operations. America didn't win the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union won the Eastern Front through unimaginable sacrifice and stubborn courage. But America made that victory possible by solving the equation that Soviet industry couldn't solve alone. Mass-produced excellence, simple, reliable, unglamorous trucks that worked when everything else failed. The Studebaker US6 wasn't the weapon that saved Moscow. It was the weapon that made every other weapon work. Colonel Andrei Khrulev would survive the war. He would rise to Deputy People's Commissar of Defense for Logistics, overseeing the supply network that sustained the Red Army from Stalingrad to Berlin. He would coordinate the delivery of millions of tons of ammunition, fuel, food, and equipment across distances that staggered imagination. He would be awarded the Order of Lenin twice. But in his private papers archived after his death in 1962, Khrulev wrote most extensively about one thing: American trucks. "There is a myth," he wrote, "that the Soviet Union won the Great Patriotic War alone, through strength of will and sacrifice. This is half true. We did sacrifice everything. 27 million entire cities erased. But will alone does not move tanks. Gasoline moves tanks. And gasoline arrives in... The Americans gave us 477,785 trucks. I remember each one. Every Studebaker that arrived at Arkhangelsk was one more unit that could advance. One more kilometer we could sustain offensive operations. One more day we could keep fighting. History will remember the T-34. History will remember Zhukov and the Battle of Moscow. They probably never imagined their trucks would save Moscow. But they did. By war's end, American Lend-Lease provided the Soviet Union with 477,785 trucks and 4 drive vehicles, 51,503 jeeps, 14,795 aircraft, 7,056 tanks, 8,218 anti-aircraft guns, 1.9 million tons of steel, 4.5 million tons of food. The total value, approximately $11.3 billion, equivalent to $180 billion in 2024. Stalin's official acknowledgement was grudging. At the Tehran Conference in 1943, when pressed by Roosevelt about Lend-Lease's impact, Stalin replied, "Without American production, the United Nations could never have won the war." Privately, he said more. According to Nikita Khrushchev's memoirs, Stalin stated, "The Americans gave us so many materials, without which we wouldn't have been able to form our reserves or continue the war." But in Soviet public discourse, Lend-Lease was minimized. Post-war propaganda emphasized Soviet self-sufficiency. The narrative became Soviet workers, Soviet tanks, Soviet courage defeated fascism. No mention of American trucks. The Studebaker became a ghost weapon, omnipresent but invisible. Soviet veterans knew better. In memoirs published after the Soviet Union's collapse, soldiers described the trucks with almost affectionate detail. They gave them nicknames: Studebaker Musik, Studebaker Peasant, the American. They praised the truck's reliability, their simplicity, their refusal to quit even in conditions that destroyed Soviet vehicles. One veteran interviewed in 1997 said, "I drove a Studebaker from Moscow to Berlin, 2,800 kilometers, through mud, snow, summer heat. The truck never broke down, not once. My friends driving Soviet trucks, they broke down constantly. We joked that the Studebaker was the best weapon America sent us." After the war, thousands of Studebakers remained in Soviet service. They hauled construction materials during post-war reconstruction. They served on collective farms. They worked in forestry and mining operations in there. The last military service Studebakers weren't retired until the 1980s, 40 years after their delivery. Today, Studebaker US6 trucks are museum pieces. A few are preserved in Russian military museums, displayed alongside T-34 tanks and Katyusha rocket launchers. Informational plaques note their American origin and wartime service, but they remain footnotes. The unglamorous weapon, the forgotten multiplier. Yet without them, the Eastern Front might have unfolded very differently. Imagine Moscow falling in December 1941. Hitler controls Soviet European territory. The Red Army. Stalin perhaps negotiates an armistice. Germany consolidates its conquests. No Stalingrad, no Kursk, no Berlin. History pivots on the invisible. This is the deeper lesson of the Studebaker story. In complex systems, the limiting factor is rarely the most visible component. Soviet tank production was spectacular, but tank production wasn't the limiting factor. Logistics was the limiting factor. This pattern recurs throughout military history. The Napoleonic Grand Army didn't fail because French soldiers were cowards. It failed because supply lines to Moscow collapsed. Germany's 1918 spring offensive didn't fail because the stormtroopers were ineffective. It failed because Allied logistics sustained defensive operations better than German logistics sustained offensive ones. Modern militaries understand this now. American military doctrine explicitly states, amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. But in 1941, only a handful of Soviet logistics officers grasped that trucks might be more important than tanks. Khrulev was one. He fought bureaucratic battles to secure American truck deliveries while his colleagues demanded more glamorous weapons. He was right. They were wrong. And because Khrulev understood the mathematics of warfare, because American factories produced trucks by the hundreds of thousands, Moscow survived. The German army came within 35 kilometers of the Kremlin. They could see Moscow's skyline through binoculars. And then, fueled and supplied by American trucks, Soviet counteroffensives drove them back. The workers in South Bend, Indiana, probably never knew. They built trucks. They went home. They collected paychecks. And they saved Moscow. If you found this exploration of industrial warfare compelling, subscribe for more hidden stories where logistics defeated armies and factories decided battles. What other forgotten weapons of World War II should we investigate? Tell us in the comments. The war wasn't won by warriors alone. It was won by workers, engineers, and 477,785 trucks. And that story deserves to be told.